Hello, my dear friends. They called it art, but much of it was closer to sin disguised in oil and light. Behind the velvet curtains of Victorian studios, beauty was twisted, worshipped, and violated in the same breath. Lovers were turned to pigment, wives became muses by force, and sketchbooks hid crimes no one dared name. Every masterpiece had a pulse once, and some still seem to breathe beneath the paint. Tonight, you'll step into that world, where every stroke of genius carries the shadow of desire, and every secret still whispers from the canvas. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Consider turning on a fan for a soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to enter the private studios of Victorian artists, the air would seem quiet and dignified, heavy with the scent of paint and turpentine. Yet what happened behind those closed doors was often far from pure art. The light came from high windows, falling softly on wooden floors covered in sketches and half-finished canvases. Easels stood like silent witnesses to scenes that blurred the line between creation and indulgence. In those rooms, the idea of artistic study became a mask for desires that society preferred not to name. Painters spoke of form, proportion, and divine beauty, but what they truly sought was control over the bodies that stood before them. The human figure, especially the female one, became both subject and prey, stripped of modesty in the name of inspiration. What was called art was often nothing more than an excuse for obsession. In many studios, the artist would ask the model to remove each piece of clothing slowly, pretending to observe the fall of fabric, the way light curved around skin. To outsiders, it was an anatomy lesson, but within those walls, it was intimacy disguised as study. The painters claimed that to paint the human body truly, they had to see every detail, every shadow. Some even believed that the act of touching would help them understand the form better. Brushes dipped in colour often followed the lines of a shoulder or hip before they ever touched a canvas. It is almost laughable how the word art was stretched so far that lust could comfortably hide behind it. The models, many of them poor women desperate for wages, stood still in cold rooms, pretending not to notice the gaze that examined them more as flesh than as form. The profession of the model was both common and shameful. They were praised for their beauty but condemned for exposing it. To the upper classes, they existed only as curiosities, necessary for creation yet unworthy of respect. Some were household servants, some widows, some girls from the street who saw modelling as a way to survive another week. Their payment was small, and their dignity smaller still. If we compare this to today, it would be like a company using workers' bodies as tools, calling exploitation a creative necessity. The irony is difficult to ignore, especially when the art produced from these sessions later hung in galleries as symbols of purity and grace. Behind every serene portrait was a real woman forced to stand half-naked for hours, her silence mistaken for consent. The environment of the studio itself added to the illusion of legitimacy. Velvet curtains softened the light, plaster statues of Greek gods lined the shelves, and sketches of angels covered the walls. Amid this, a living body seemed merely another object for study. The artist's voice guided the pose, the turn of the neck, the placement of the hands, as if commanding clay instead of a human being. Paint mixed with sweat. The scent of oil mingled with the faint salt of skin. Yet in the end, what appeared on canvas was called beauty, not exploitation. Society admired the art but ignored the process. The boundary between observation and possession vanished so easily that no one could tell when admiration became hunger. Some artists went further still. They abandoned the canvas altogether, choosing to paint directly onto the bodies of their models. They claimed it was to study texture or colour under living skin. Patterns were drawn across stomachs, shoulders, and thighs. The brush became an instrument of both art and dominance. For the models, standing still under the pretense of inspiration was a quiet humiliation. Their bodies were treated like materials, surfaces to be covered, not beings to be respected. It is unsettling to think that in rooms filled with talk of beauty, the act itself was so deeply ugly. In those moments, art ceased to be creation and became something parasitic, feeding on the very people it claimed to honour. The public knew little of what occurred inside the artist's studio. Paintings that reached exhibitions were celebrated for their realism and emotional depth. Critics wrote about light, colour, and technique, but never about the trembling body that stood behind the brush. In diaries and letters, a few artists admitted to their method, but always with pride, not guilt. To them, passion and genius were excuses enough. Society, obsessed with appearance, accepted this reasoning without question. The artist was seen as visionaries, not voyeurs. Their models, when mentioned at all, were described as muses, never victims. Art schools encouraged this tradition. Students were taught that the human form was sacred, that nudity was not indecency but truth. Yet this language of purity conveniently protected the powerful from scrutiny. It allowed male artists to view, touch, and direct women's bodies under a moral shield. The model's silence was taken as compliance, her discomfort dismissed as modesty. The longer she stood still, the more her image was consumed. Beauty, it seemed, required suffering. Inspiration demanded obedience. Every stroke of the brush immortalized not freedom, but the quiet endurance of the observed. The deception was complete. The art world spoke endlessly of ideals, of divine proportions and eternal beauty, while ignoring the human cost. Paintings of Venus and nymphs became decorations in the homes of men who would never let their wives be seen that way. The hypocrisy was as polished as the marble floors of their galleries. The artists themselves defended their work with confidence, calling it study, worship, or celebration. Yet beneath every canvas lay a truth as plain as the naked skin they had painted. Even when rumours spread about the behaviour of certain painters, nothing changed. Talent excused everything. Fame made sin invisible. A few models spoke privately about what they endured, but no one listened. Their words carried little weight against the prestige of a man whose name hung beneath gold-framed portraits. What remained was silence, and the art that turned exploitation into admiration. The myth of artistic necessity endured, stronger than any moral outrage. In the end, the excuse of art became a shield so strong that it outlasted its victims. Painters continued to paint, critics continued to praise, and the world continued to look at the result without questioning the means. I can't help but think how easy it is for power to disguise itself as genius when everyone prefers beauty to truth. What was presented as inspiration was often nothing more than domination, made acceptable by a single word: art. The illusion of creativity hid countless humiliations. The claim of artistic freedom allowed cruelty to wear the mask of sophistication. Somewhere between the strokes of admiration and desire, art lost its innocence. The brush that touched skin would soon touch canvas again, carrying both colour and guilt. What began as a study of beauty had already crossed a boundary it would never return from. Beneath the elegance of every painting, something darker waited to be revealed. The artists' studios became the stage where morality quietly unravelled. Their words of devotion to beauty concealed acts that blurred the very idea of creation itself. And somewhere beyond those closed doors, another ritual of art and desire was already taking form, one that would make even these scenes seem almost innocent in comparison. The studios of Victorian artists often blurred the line between a place of creation and a place of indulgence. What should have been filled with the smell of paint and the sound of brushes against canvas became heavy with the scent of perfume, candle smoke, and the quiet rustle of fabric. Curtains of red velvet hung over the windows to soften the light, but they also served another purpose, keeping outsiders from seeing what truly happened inside. Beds appeared among easels and pallets, their sheets as carefully arranged as any still life. The furniture seemed to belong to a private room rather than a workspace. The excuse was always the same: comfort helped inspiration. The model needed rest after hours of posing, and the intimacy of the room allowed for artistic freedom. Yet the truth was simpler. The studio had turned into a bedroom, and art had become an alibi. The models who stayed behind after dusk rarely had a choice. When the session ended, the painter might suggest that it was too late to walk home, or that they would start again early in the morning. The candles were relit, the curtains drawn, and what began as work quietly shifted into something else. The pretext of convenience hid a reality of control. Once the door was closed, there were no witnesses, no rules. The same hands that adjusted the model's pose by daylight traced the same lines for different reasons by night. It is darkly amusing how Victorian society could condemn open desire in public, yet tolerate it when cloaked in the name of art. To the artist, the body was still a subject, only now studied through touch instead of observation. Some studios became known for their atmosphere, heavy and suggestive, where the scent of oil paint mixed with the warmth of bodies. The air hung thick with the memory of what had taken place there. Canvases leaned against walls, unfinished, while beds bore wrinkles that had nothing to do with sleep. Artists defended this mingling of work and pleasure as natural, even noble. They claimed that only through complete familiarity with the human form could true emotion be captured on canvas. But their studies of anatomy were only excuses for possession. The models who resisted were replaced. Those who stayed did so out of fear or necessity, knowing that reputation could be destroyed with a single whisper. The glow of candles softened everything, turning reality into illusion. The flickering light made skin appear smoother, shadows deeper, and guilt easier to ignore. For the artist, it was the perfect atmosphere for inspiration. Paintings of reclining figures and tender embraces began to appear in galleries, praised for their intimacy and warmth. Few suspected that the poses had been born not of imagination, but of reenactments performed behind those velvet curtains. It is like imagining a modern photographer setting up a photo shoot in a hotel room and calling it research on lighting. The boundary between art and desire had vanished, replaced by comfort, secrecy, and denial. For many of these men, the studio became a stage where fantasy could take physical form. The model's body was rearranged like furniture, her expression guided to match the painter's vision. To capture emotion, he demanded surrender. To capture grace, he demanded stillness. When the session ended, he might ask her to stay, to rest, to be ready for the next day's work. It sounded reasonable, even caring. But by morning, the arrangement had changed. The studio was no longer a place of creation, but of exhaustion. I can almost feel how heavy the silence must have been in those rooms when the candles finally went out, leaving only the smell of paint and regret. When critics visited, the rooms were carefully arranged again. The bed disappeared behind a folding screen, and canvases were moved to cover stains on the floor. The light streaming through the curtains gave everything a respectable glow. Visitors praised the devotion of the artists who lived so closely with their work, unaware of how literal that closeness was. Patrons came to admire sketches pinned to the walls, not realizing that many had been drawn in moments that blurred into sin. The deception worked perfectly, because it was built on society's willingness not to see what it did not want to know. The women themselves were left with little choice. Some accepted their fate quietly, convincing themselves that this was the price of survival. Others tried to speak of what happened, but gossip turned truth into scandal, and scandal into shame. Once labelled as loose or fallen, no woman could find respectable work again. Painters, however, continued without consequence. They were admired for their genius, invited to salons, and celebrated in the press. Their victims became invisible, erased as cleanly as mistakes on a sketch. The bed in the studio remained, waiting for the next sitter, the next inspiration, the next excuse. There was a strange consistency in how these studios functioned. They followed patterns of control disguised as collaboration. Artists spoke of freedom, but it was their own freedom they protected, not that of the people who stood before them. The room that should have been filled with creation became a space of quiet coercion. Every candlelit session left traces that paint could not cover. The irony of it all was that these artists believed themselves to be seekers of truth, yet their work was built entirely on lies. In public, society still revered them as visionaries. Their paintings hung in exhibitions under titles that suggested innocence, names like repose, study of form, or the sleeping muse. Viewers admired the soft light, the delicate posture, never questioning how such scenes were achieved. Behind each image of beauty was a night of manipulation that no critic could imagine. To those outside the studio, art was an achievement of the mind. Inside, it was an act of power. These studios reflected the same hypocrisy that ran through Victorian life itself, outwardly moral, inwardly indulgent, always maintaining the illusion of purity. Every velvet curtain hid not only flesh but truth. Art became a ritual that required submission, dressed in the language of devotion. The blending of art and intimacy created a system where the abuse of power could flourish under the gaze of beauty. The painter's hand, steady and practiced, could justify anything if it was called inspiration. By the time morning light filtered through the curtains, the room returned to its quiet order. The bed straightened, the brushes washed, the canvas adjusted to catch the day's first glow. To anyone entering, it looked like the beginning of another day's work. Only the model knew what had truly taken place, though her story would never be told. The studio had become both a workshop and a witness, holding secrets that paint could never reveal. And as the city awoke beyond its windows, another artist prepared to begin again, brush in hand, waiting for his muse to return. The transformation of the studio into a bedroom marked the moment when art stopped being imitation and became participation. The merging of creation and desire blurred every line once thought sacred. Somewhere, beyond the painted smiles and candlelight, a deeper corruption was quietly taking hold, one that would soon turn inspiration into ritual. In the art circles of Victorian society, the word muse carried a sacred weight. It implied inspiration, purity, and devotion. But inside the dimly lit studios, the word became something far more dangerous. The woman who posed for the artist was no longer just a subject. She was made into the key that unlocked his supposed genius. The myth of the muse allowed the artist to blur the border between admiration and possession, claiming that his passion for art could not be separated from his desire for her. The promise of beauty became the justification for everything that followed. In this world, affection was not given freely. It was taken and then repainted into something noble. Many artists spoke of needing an emotional connection to create. They said their work lost its life without it. The model, caught between survival and flattery, became a captive audience to this manipulation. The painter would speak of divine inspiration, of how her presence stirred his soul, but beneath the poetic words was the clear demand for submission. Those who refused were told they lacked dedication, that true art required sacrifice. Those who gave in were rewarded with false promises of fame and immortality. Their faces might appear in paintings admired by the wealthy, yet their names were never written beside them. It is bitterly ironic how the muse, the supposed source of inspiration, was the one forced to bear the weight of the artist's ego. Some painters claimed that without physical intimacy, they could not capture emotion. They confused lust with creativity and called it genius. The act of conquest became part of the creative process, as though violating a woman's will could somehow give depth to the lines of a painting. Many believed that to possess the muse was to own her beauty, to control not just her body but her very existence on the canvas. If we compared this to today, it would be like a director demanding affection to film emotion, disguising exploitation as art. The illusion of romance covered a darker truth, one where power ruled and silence was the only protection. The relationships that formed in these studios rarely resembled love. They were one-sided devotions, sculpted by fear and dependence. The artist's charm, his reputation, and his control of money and influence left little room for refusal. The model became an accessory to his fame, her role essential yet invisible. When she wept, he called it inspiration. When she hesitated, he called it modesty. When she submitted, he called it art. I find it haunting how easily pain can be mistaken for passion when power writes the story. What the world saw in his paintings was tenderness. What she lived was obedience. The illusion of romance was further strengthened by the way society admired such pairings. The public loved the idea of the artist and his muse, imagining their connection as a meeting of souls rather than a theft of freedom. Magazines and salons repeated these stories, calling them love affairs touched by genius. The truth was never printed. Behind every painting of affection was a night of coercion. Behind every gaze of devotion was fear. The painter held all the control. If the muse resisted, her reputation could be destroyed. If she spoke out, no one would listen. And so she became part of the art in the worst possible way, erased but essential, in the quiet hours of evening, when the streets emptied and candles burned low. The studio changed again. The artist's tone softened. His gestures became intimate, his words full of praise. He told her she was more than a model, that she was his light, his guide. The words felt heavy with sincerity, but they were crafted with purpose. Once affection was secured, consent was assumed. Resistance faded into exhaustion. When the painting was finished, so was the artist's devotion. The muse was left behind, discarded like the brushes that had served their use. The next face would come soon enough. Another woman convinced that her suffering would be remembered as beauty. Critics and collectors adored the results. They praised the raw emotion in the art, the intensity of feeling, the depth of love captured on canvas. They saw masterpieces, not manipulation. The artist's reputation grew, while the model's life shrank to whispers. Those who dared to speak were accused of hysteria, a word society used to silence women who dared to complain. No one asked how emotion could be painted so perfectly without cruelty shaping its edges. The public believed what it wanted to believe, that beauty was born from love, not pain. For many of these women, the experience left lasting scars. Some vanished from the records entirely. Others ended in asylums or poverty, their faces still hanging in galleries long after their names were forgotten. The irony is cruel. Admiration for their image survived, but compassion for their suffering did not. The artist, meanwhile, continued to paint, his genius unquestioned, his victims unseen. Every brushstroke concealed a story of dominance. Every finished work was both a confession and a disguise. The myth of the muse endured because it was convenient. It allowed men to elevate desire into philosophy. They could speak of art and beauty while practicing control and deceit. Society, desperate to preserve its ideals of refinement, accepted these fictions without hesitation. The more disturbing the truth became, the more elaborate the justifications grew. Passion was sacred, and anything sacred was beyond reproach. The muse, trapped between admiration and abuse, became the silent offering on the altar of art. In time, even the models themselves began to repeat the words of their oppressors. Some convinced themselves it was love, that their suffering had meaning, that to be chosen by a great man was a privilege. Others stayed silent, fearing ridicule more than pain. The cycle continued, generation after generation. as art schools and galleries kept feeding the myth of the noble muse. The image of the artist as a tormented genius remained intact, his cruelty mistaken for complexity. The paintings of these relationships still hang today, admired for their tenderness and beauty. But if one looks closely, the emotion in those eyes is not love, it is endurance. The lips not soft with affection, but sealed with resignation. The art of the time was not born from freedom, but from captivity disguised as devotion. The so-called muse was not a partner in creation, but its cost. The story of the muse becoming the artist's captive reveals how easily power corrupts the language of inspiration. What the world called beauty was built on silence, and that silence was maintained by fear. Beneath the gentle light of those portraits lies a truth that even the artists refused to see. Somewhere within that stillness, behind the soft edges of the paint, another kind of darkness waited, one that would soon turn the act of painting itself into a performance of desire. Among the strangest practices whispered about in the artistic circles of Victorian times was the belief that true inspiration could only be reached at the height of physical pleasure. Some painters became convinced that their bodies had to merge with their art to reveal what they called the truth of form. They claimed that the moment of climax opened a doorway to pure creativity. That passion itself was the bridge between man and genius. These ideas were discussed behind locked doors, among the same men who lectured publicly about virtue and restraint. What began as an obsession disguised as philosophy soon turned into a ritual. The studio, once filled with sketches and silence, became a space where flesh and colour blended under candlelight, and the boundary between creation and corruption disappeared completely. The painter would prepare his studio with deliberate care, curtains drawn, candles lit, the air thick with the scent of oil and skin. The model, already stripped of modesty by hours of posing, was now told that the act itself was part of the art. The painter would move his hand not just across the canvas but across her body, tracing shapes with charcoal or ink while they intertwined. To him, the trembling of her body was not shame but rhythm, a living movement to be captured in the moment. He called it art in motion. It is absurd to think that ecstasy was treated as a substitute for talent, but in a time so obsessed with purity, Sin simply learned to speak the language of art. The lines drawn on her skin dried into strange patterns, a mix of sweat and pigment that blurred the difference between painting and possession. The works born from these encounters were called living compositions. They were rarely shown in public, but among collectors they became a secret fascination. The idea that a painting had been created in the midst of passion gave it a mystique that money could not buy. Some believed the energy of the act lingered within the paint itself, that the canvas carried traces of life and death combined. Artists claimed that by uniting the act of love with the act of creation, they had reached a form of divinity. Their arrogance was limitless. If we compare this to today, it would be like a musician insisting his performance only becomes authentic if he bleeds on the strings. The confusion of pain and art became a kind of faith. For the models, however, there was nothing divine in what took place. They were reduced to living canvases, their skin a surface for the painter's delusion. The charcoal stained their backs, the ink soaked into pores, leaving marks that no washing could remove. These sessions were not about beauty but about control, not about creativity but about dominance. Some women endured it in silence, hoping that their compliance would spare them worse humiliation. Others wept quietly when the artist turned away, their tears mingling with the ink that covered their bodies. It chills me to imagine how easily cruelty could disguise itself as transcendence when everyone agreed to call it art. The so-called living artworks were admired in private rooms, surrounded by whispers and laughter. Collectors speculated about the stories behind them, guessing which women had inspired which pieces. No one spoke of consent. The painter's genius excused everything, turning the act itself into myth. Even among peers, these stories became tokens of pride. To boast of creating during pleasure was to claim mastery over both art and body. The model, meanwhile, disappeared from the story entirely. Her role ended when the brush left her skin. When critics later analysed these works, they noted the energy in the strokes, the immediacy of feeling. They praised the raw emotion without realising that what they admired was violence transformed into texture. The artists wrote letters about their methods, explaining that physical ecstasy dissolved boundaries, that the body and mind became one. Some spoke of achieving enlightenment through this act, describing themselves as priests of sensual creation. The hypocrisy of Victorian morality allowed them to thrive. Publicly, they condemned indecency. Privately, they celebrated it with brushes dipped in sin. As rumours spread, fascination grew. Younger painters began to imitate the method, believing it would give their work the same intensity. Studios filled with dim light and strange experiments. Every moan became part of the composition, every shiver a stroke of inspiration. What was once shocking turned into a trend, spoken of as avant-garde among those who sought fame through scandal. The more grotesque the practice, the more celebrated it became in secret societies of art. The act of creation was no longer about the world outside the studio, but about the worship of self. These rituals left no room for morality or emotion. The body of the model was treated like clay, reshaped by hands that called themselves divine. Some artists even used bodily fluids to mix their pigments, convinced that it gave the paint life. The paintings that resulted were chaotic and dark, full of movement but devoid of meaning. Still, they sold well. Collectors desired the taboo, the feeling of owning something born from forbidden acts. They saw it as proof of authenticity, as if corruption itself could make beauty more real. Behind the curtains, the truth was uglier. The women involved often suffered injuries, infections, or emotional collapse. The combination of physical strain and humiliation left scars that no one saw. The artists moved on easily, finding new muses to replace the broken ones. Their work continued to be praised, their names celebrated as innovators. The cycle repeated, with each generation pushing boundaries further under the pretense of truth. The myth of the living masterpiece persisted, blending lust with legend until they became indistinguishable. By the time daylight returned to those studios, what remained was the scent of smoke, ink, and sweat. The canvases stood drying in silence, carrying the weight of what could never be spoken aloud. Those who saw them only admired the passion, not the pain. The artists believed they had captured the moment of divine creation, but what they truly preserved was desecration, framed and hung on walls as brilliance. The difference between worship and violation had been erased. The artists who painted through passion believed they had touched eternity. Yet all they touched was the limit of decency itself. Their so-called masterpieces revealed how obsession can dress itself as genius, and how pleasure can be mistaken for truth. Beyond those candlelit studios, as the night's silence deepened and vanity settled like dust, a new fascination was already stirring, one that would seek purity itself and turn innocence into a commodity. Among the strangest customs of Victorian art was the obsession with purity, a fascination that mixed commerce, morality, and voyeurism into one unsettling ritual. In certain studios, young women stood as subjects not because of who they were, but because of what they represented. Painters were commissioned to capture their image on canvas just before marriage, a final proof of innocence before it was supposedly lost. The portrait of a virgin bride became both an artwork and a document, admired by collectors and families alike. The irony was unbearable. Art was turned into evidence, and the body of a woman into something that could be certified, displayed, and sold. What began as a celebration of beauty ended as a transaction of virtue. The painter's studio on such evenings was unnervingly ceremonial. Curtains were drawn, candles lit, and the air grew tense with the smell of oil paint and anticipation. The young model, often trembling with nerves, was told that she must remove her clothing so the artist could capture truth. There was talk of realism, of preserving the natural glow of untouched skin, of immortalizing youth in its purest form. Yet beneath the lofty words lingered the same hunger that had haunted every other canvas. The artist's brush wandered slowly, pretending to worship form while consuming it. The idea of art became nothing more than a polite disguise for intrusion. It is almost comical how men who preached about virtue were the same ones demanding naked proof of it. These portraits were painted in haste, often completed within a single night. The bride-to-be would stand still for hours while the painter studied every detail, justifying his gaze as professional duty. To him, her unease was part of the composition, the trembling hands, the shallow breath, the lowered eyes. Each hesitation made the portrait more authentic. The finished painting was meant to show serenity, purity, and perfection, but anyone who looked closer could see the tension beneath the surface. The innocence it claimed to preserve had already been stolen by the act of observation itself. If we compare this to today, it would be like a photographer demanding a woman's vulnerability as proof of beauty, disguising discomfort as art. These portraits were not always kept within the family. Some were sold or auctioned to collectors who prized them for their supposed symbolism of chastity. The younger the sitter, the higher the price. The titles were poetic: Before the Dawn, The First Light, Promise, but the meaning was unmistakable. The painting served as a certificate of untouched value, a visual guarantee of purity. What should have been private became a public spectacle. The irony deepened when those same paintings later hung in rooms filled with smoke and laughter, admired by men who spoke of innocence while indulging in its image. I find it unbearable to think how a woman's worth could be measured in brushstrokes, her virtue frozen in paint to satisfy a buyer's pride. For many of these women, posing for such a portrait was not a choice but an obligation. Families insisted, believing it to be an honour, a proof of respectability. The painter was usually chosen by the groom's family, his work trusted to reflect the woman's true state. The model's shame or discomfort mattered little. Her image was not hers to own. When the painting was done, it became property, a possession exchanged with a dowry, a symbol of what was being given away. The illusion of romance turned into a ledger of control. Some painters took advantage of this power, instructing their subjects to pose in ways that blurred the line between reverence and exposure. A soft gaze, a slight tilt of the shoulder, the fall of fabric, all arranged to suggest virtue but invite curiosity. The paradox was deliberate. The public could praise modesty while secretly consuming desire. These images satisfied both morality and lust, allowing society to sin in silence. The purity of art became the purity of ownership. The canvas was praised not for what it revealed, but for what it promised. Some painters claimed this practice elevated the female form to divine status. They said they sought the moment before change, the last breath of innocence before marriage transformed a girl into a woman. Yet what they truly captured was fear, a fragile moment where youth was trapped under the weight of expectation. The subjects' faces often carried the same expression: calm, resigned, almost lifeless. The stillness admired by critics was not serenity, but surrender. Those who stood before the canvas decades later could never imagine the trembling behind those painted eyes. As the paintings spread across parlours and galleries, society pretended not to see the cruelty within them. To question the ritual was to question the institution of marriage itself. The silence around these portraits became a collective agreement, a way to protect both reputation and profit. Artists continued to produce them, families continued to buy them, and the cycle of commodified virtue endured. The portrait of a bride-to-be became not a celebration of love, but a receipt of possession. Even long after the wedding, these images retained a strange power. Husbands displayed them as trophies, proof that their wives had once belonged only to them. In death, The same portraits were sometimes placed beside the coffin, as if to remind the world of a virtue that could not decay. Art had replaced humanity, and morality had turned into spectacle. What was once private had been made eternal, painted over with layers of hypocrisy. These portraits reveal how deeply Victorian society confused morality with control. Purity was never about the woman herself. It was about ownership, reputation, and the illusion of order. Each brushstroke reinforced the idea that virtue could be seen, that the female body existed to be verified. The art world called it beauty, the families called it honour, but it was neither. It was the quiet exploitation of innocence turned into tradition, one that would leave its ghost lingering on every polished frame. The trade in purity disguised as art exposed the ugliest truth of all, that the celebration of innocence was merely another form of corruption. Behind every painted bride was a transaction. Behind every stroke of white paint was fear. And beyond the gilded frames that held their images, another obsession was already forming, one that would strip away not just modesty, but the very idea of humanity itself. Among the most disturbing fixations in the world of Victorian art was the obsession with what painters called natural beauty. Beneath that phrase hid an unspoken fascination with the most private details of the human body. For certain artists, the untouched, unshaven state of their models became proof of authenticity. Something they claimed revealed the wild essence of womanhood. They forbade their models from shaving, insisting that every strand of hair carried the truth of nature. What began as talk of realism turned into a fetish, and what they called art became an act of control disguised as appreciation. The pretense of purity masked a darker hunger that no philosophy of aesthetics could justify. These painters claimed that removing a single hair was an act of falsehood. They lectured about honesty in representation, about rejecting artificial beauty, yet their arguments had little to do with truth and everything to do with possession. They wanted their models not only to stand still but to remain as raw as possible, untouched by any mark of civility. The so-called return to nature was merely a return to domination. The studio became a stage for their fantasies of primal desire, where every imperfection was celebrated only because it belonged to them. It is grotesquely funny that the same men who demanded elegance in manners insisted on savagery in skin. During these sessions, painters study their subjects with an almost clinical intensity. They claim to trace the lines of shadow and texture with respect, but their gaze lingered longer than any artistic purpose required. The models, often too poor to refuse, endured the scrutiny in silence. The artist told them they were preserving truth, that the canvas would immortalize their natural state. Yet what appeared on those canvases was not truth, but obsession. If we compared it to today, it would be like calling surveillance an act of love, watching someone endlessly, and claiming it is for their own beauty. The irony was endless, the cruelty subtle. These women became exhibits of honesty in a system that denied them dignity. The details in these paintings were disturbingly precise. Each hair was rendered carefully, each curve shadowed with tenderness that felt invasive. The painters called it realism, but it was closer to reverence, a ritualistic fascination with what should have remained private. They said these depictions captured the untamed energy of the female body, the essence of life that civilization tried to hide. Critics, speaking in polished tones, praised the courage of such work, calling it daring and profound. In truth, it was neither. It was curiosity turned to worship, and worship turned to desecration. The model's vulnerability was transformed into a spectacle. The private turned public in the name of art. Some painters took their obsession beyond the canvas. When the session ended, they kept the strands of hair that had fallen during posing, wrapping them carefully in cloth or sealing them in small jars. These were not mementos of artistic study, but trophies of control. To them, the hair symbolized possession, proof that they had captured not just an image but a piece of the woman herself. I find it deeply unsettling that a trace so intimate could be treated like a relic, worshipped by men who mistook their own hunger for enlightenment. It was as if the closer they came to what was human, the less humanity they retained. The language of art continued to excuse everything. Painters described their work as an exploration of nature, of truth, of the beauty untouched by the artificial. But their nature was selective, their truth self-serving. The same society that demanded women hide their bodies under layers of cloth-admired paintings that exposed them completely. The contradiction was breathtaking. These artists, hailed as geniuses, used the word primitive as praise, forgetting that what they admired was simply what they had taken without permission. Their admiration was always for what they controlled. In galleries, these works drew both fascination and discomfort. Viewers pretended to study form and composition, but their eyes always returned to the same forbidden details. The critics' words were full of restraint, describing the honesty of the depiction, the boldness of the brushwork. Yet behind the compliments lay the same impulse that had driven the artist to paint it. Victorian decency found a loophole, desire made respectable by the frame of art. The male gaze became immortal, safe behind varnish and gold borders. The very thing society claimed to hide was now glorified under its most refined institutions. For the models, however, the cost was heavy. Their names were whispered, their faces recognized, their reputations ruined. A woman could be immortalized in art but erased from society. Her likeness, praised for its purity, condemned her to shame. The hair that symbolized truth became evidence of transgression. In the hands of painters and collectors, the female body became an artifact of contradiction, celebrated for its naturalness yet punished for its exposure. The purity they sought to display destroyed the purity they claimed to honor. This strange cult of naturalness said more about men's fears than about women's beauty. The obsession with control, the worship of what was unaltered, revealed a desperate attempt to own what could never be theirs. It was not the female form they admired, but the idea of dominance hidden beneath their admiration. Their art was not liberation but confinement, a mirror that reflected their own desires, not the truth they pretended to capture. In the end, these painters left behind works that were admired for centuries, called masterpieces of realism and honesty. Yet honesty was the last thing they represented. The brushstrokes that seemed so precise were drawn by hands blinded by obsession. What they created was not art that spoke of humanity, but art that silenced it. The women they painted had no voices, only textures, only shapes rendered in a reverence that felt like desecration. Worship of the natural body in Victorian art exposed a paradox that no critic dared name. These painters claimed to honour truth, yet what they honoured was their own control. Beyond those canvases that pretended to celebrate nature's purity, a colder art was waiting, one that would abandon paint altogether and begin its work upon living flesh itself. In the age of Victorian sculpture, marble was not the only material artists shaped. Flesh itself became the first medium. Before chisels ever touched stone, sculptors demanded the presence of living models to guide their hands. They spoke of form, of symmetry, of the sacred study of the human body. Yet beneath their practiced language of technique lay something far less noble. These men claimed to explore anatomy, but what they truly explored was permission, the right to touch, to measure, to own. The idea of art became their justification, the body their canvas, and consent their illusion. Inside the dim studios, blocks of stone waited beside stands where models posed under cold light. The sculptor's hands, coated in fine dust, moved across skin with what he called precision. He would press his palms into the body's contours, feeling bone and muscle, claiming to search for truth in texture. The model, usually motionless, endured his touch while he murmured about balance and proportion. To him, this was research. To her, it was an intrusion. It is painfully absurd how easily the word study could excuse anything, even the theft of dignity. When the sculptor found a shape that pleased him, he called it discovery. He spoke of the living material as though the body in front of him existed for no reason but to guide his art. His gaze lingered on every detail, reducing humanity to geometry, to ensure perfection. He often ordered the model to hold impossible poses for hours, ignoring pain and exhaustion. When she trembled, he called it movement. When she cried, he called it realism. The marble he carved later would be smooth and flawless, but the process that created it was raw and merciless. If we compare this to today, it would be like a designer taking measurements with both admiration and ownership, confusing accuracy with authority. Some sculptors went further, abandoning sketches entirely. They decided that the truest form of realism was contact itself. They coated the model's body in plaster to create a direct mould, sealing her in a cold shell that hardened slowly while she struggled to breathe. The process was painful and dangerous, but they called it art. The mould, once dried and removed, carried every curve and hollow of her form. The artist could then carve his statue with precision, guided by what he had stolen from life. The woman beneath the plaster became invisible. Only her outline remained. I find it haunting to imagine how silence must have filled those rooms, as if the act of breathing itself had to bow before the pursuit of perfection. The language of sculpture wrapped itself in reverence. Artists spoke of eternal beauty, of immortalizing the human spirit through stone. But the spirit was gone long before the chisel struck. What remained was flesh turned into object, existence stripped of voice. The marble Venus standing proudly in galleries was born not from admiration but from endurance. Every curve admired by critics was a memory of discomfort, every smooth surface the result of a body forced into stillness. The sculptor became a kind of priest, transforming pain into purity, worshipping the form while ignoring the soul that gave it shape. In those years, plaster moulds became a secret obsession. Some sculptors kept the moulds themselves as trophies, hidden away in basements and storerooms. They spoke of their collection of studies as if they were sacred relics. Each one represented a woman who had stood before them, silent and still, her image captured in white. The mould preserved not only her shape but also her vulnerability. It was art that remembered suffering without ever admitting it. Critics praised these statues for their realism, calling them divine, never realizing that divinity had been carved from submission. The sculptor's touch, always justified as technical, became ritualistic. He pressed, smoothed, and measured as though performing a ceremony. He said the warmth of living skin guided his inspiration, that to understand the body's grace, he had to feel it. No one questioned this logic. Apprentices watched in reverence, repeating the same gestures in their own work. The cycle of imitation became the cycle of exploitation, handed down like craft secrets. What began as art turned into inheritance, the inheritance of power disguised as technique. For the models, the experience left marks both visible and unseen. Some suffered burns from the plaster, others fainted from the heat or the weight of the mould. They were paid little, often less than a servant's wages, and their names were never mentioned in exhibition halls. Their contribution, though carved into history, remained unspoken. Their likeness adorned fountains, gardens, and palaces, yet they walked the streets unknown. Their pain became beauty. Their silence became permanence. The statues themselves told nothing of this suffering. The marble glowed softly under gallery light, cold and pure. Viewers admired the skill, the precision, the illusion of softness. They saw the goddess, not the woman who had been trapped in plaster so she could be remade in stone. The distance between artist and subject had vanished, leaving only the illusion of control. The sculptor had made not just a statue, but a monument to his own dominance. As decades passed, these works were revered as symbols of human achievement, Museums celebrated them, tourists photographed them, and art students copied them. Few ever wondered what it meant that beauty required pain, that eternity was carved from flesh and fear. The artists were praised for capturing life so perfectly, yet their art began by stealing it. The bodies that had inspired their masterpieces were long gone, forgotten beneath the weight of admiration. The sculptors of the Victorian era believed they had elevated humanity through stone, but what they truly did was immortalize exploitation. Every statue of calm perfection carried the ghost of a real woman standing cold and silent behind it. Outside those polished halls of marble and reverence, a new form of artistry was emerging, one that would abandon restraint entirely and turn creation itself into an act of indulgence. In the hidden corners of Victorian cities, behind shuttered doors and curtained windows, artists gathered at night for what they called private salons. To the public, these meetings were said to be discussions of art and beauty, evenings of inspiration and exchange among refined minds. In truth, they were something else entirely. Beneath the glow of candles and the hum of whispered laughter, the so-called artistic societies became theatres of indulgence. Painters, sculptors, and poets met to celebrate what they claimed was the liberation of the body through creativity. What began as talk of art soon dissolved into ritual, where the line between creation and corruption was deliberately erased. The gatherings became their own kind of ceremony, one that worshipped flesh more than form. These events often began innocently enough. Wine was poured, music played softly, and talk turned to philosophy and aesthetics. Then the tone shifted. Curtains were drawn tighter, the air thickened with perfume and smoke, and the conversations about beauty took on a darker intimacy. The creative ritual began. A model, sometimes paid, sometimes coerced, was brought into the centre of the room. She was asked to stand, or kneel, or lie down. Her body presented as an altar to inspiration. The artists, flushed with wine and excitement, called it the celebration of life. It is almost ridiculous how easily vice can disguise itself as enlightenment when men hold brushes instead of weapons. The body of the model became both object and tool. Some were painted directly, their skin covered in pigments and patterns meant to represent divine energy. Others were posed as living frames, holding canvases or sculptures, while the crowd of artists surrounded them. They were told this was art in its purest form, art that breathed, that existed only in the moment. The participants spoke in grand, meaningless phrases about freedom and spiritual awakening, as if words could cleanse what was happening. If we compared it to today, it would be like calling a hedonistic party a mindfulness retreat, mistaking indulgence for discovery. Every boundary that had once separated artist from subject, passion from performance, was purposefully abandoned. As the night deepened, the ceremonies grew stranger. Some painters claimed to see the divine through ecstasy, insisting that true inspiration came only when all restraint was lost. They painted or sketched as bodies intertwined before them, saying the chaos revealed truth. Sculptors pressed their hands into living flesh instead of clay, calling it the study of form. The model's humiliation became everyone's entertainment. The watchers applauded, laughing softly, their faces half hidden in candlelight. The act of art had turned into an orgy of admiration, every stroke of paint an excuse for desire, every breath a performance. These clubs were not confined to the poor or the obscure. Many members were men of reputation, their names known in galleries and academies. Yet within those secret rooms, all masks of civility fell away. They created their own rules, declaring morality an obstacle to genius. To them, sin was not shameful, it was inspiring. They claimed that repression was the enemy of creativity and that through the body, the artist could touch eternity. It was a convenient belief, one that excused every act of excess. I find it disturbing that brilliance and depravity could coexist so comfortably in the same candlelit room. Those who attended spoke afterward in riddles, describing the nights as revelations of form. They wrote letters filled with poetic metaphors, describing sweat as light, movement as grace, and indulgence as purity. What they never described was the silence of the models once the night ended. These women left behind were stained, exhausted, and shamed, while the men who had used them walked home beneath the morning fog, satisfied and inspired. The city awoke as usual, unaware that within its heart, art had turned into theatre, one that thrived on secrecy and submission. The rituals varied, but their purpose remained the same: to justify pleasure under the name of creation. Each gathering was a defiance of the moral codes the artists pretended to despise but secretly depended upon. The more forbidden the act, the greater the thrill. These men believed that transgression gave depth to their work, that breaking the rules made them visionaries. In reality, they were only performers of decadence, painting not with skill, but with arrogance. They mistook chaos for courage and confusion for genius. Their art did not challenge morality, it hid behind it. Reports of these clubs occasionally reached the newspapers, described as scandals whispered among the elite. Yet even exposure could not end them. Curiosity always outlived condemnation. For every club that was closed, another appeared under a new name, promising an even purer form of expression. The more society tried to silence them, the more they thrived on the thrill of secrecy. Art, they said, must be free, and for them, freedom meant license. What they worshipped was not beauty, but the absence of consequence. To the outside world, the participants of these gatherings were celebrated for their daring visions. Critics praised their work as bold, emotional, and spiritual, never realizing that the passion they admired came from acts too shameful to describe. The images that hung in galleries glowed with vitality, but behind each one lay the echo of a night drenched in guilt. The models' bodies had been staged, their pain transformed into spectacle. The word art had become a prayer uttered in vain, meant only to absolve those who could not control their hunger. As time passed, the stories of these secret societies faded into myth. People spoke of them as legends, romanticizing the idea of the artist as a rebel against convention. The truth was far less poetic. What they called liberation was simply indulgence, repeated until it felt sacred. They built temples of art upon the ruins of decency and called it progress. In those candlelit rooms, the idea of art as creation finally collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. The underground clubs of Victorian artists revealed a world where creation and corruption danced together in perfect rhythm. The rituals they called enlightenment were nothing more than rehearsed abandon, the worship of beauty stripped of morality. Outside those smoky rooms and fading candles, a quieter art was still being practiced, one that would leave behind the pretense of freedom and reach for something even darker, where devotion to art would demand a price in blood. In the darker corners of Victorian art, some creators sought to go beyond the limits of canvas and clay. They wanted to carve their desires into permanence, to mark their work not only with colour, but with their own flesh. These men abandoned brushes for blades, turning to engraving as a new medium for obsession. Wood, metal, and even skin became their surfaces. What they created were not pictures of beauty, but records of hunger, images so explicit, so violent, that they could never be displayed publicly. They called them studies of anatomy, or allegories of passion, but everyone who saw them knew better. These were not works of art. They were confessions cut into matter. The process was both ritualistic and cruel. The artist would prepare the materials in silence, choosing his medium with care: wood for warmth, copper for permanence, skin, sometimes his own, sometimes taken from the dead, for meaning. He claimed that only through the act of pain could he touch the soul of his subject. His tools were sharp and deliberate. The scenes he engraved were intimate yet brutal, bodies intertwined in ways that mixed pleasure with despair. Each stroke of the blade was a violation disguised as craftsmanship. It is strange to think that these men believed destruction could be a form of devotion, as if cruelty itself were holy. Some took the ritual further, mixing their own blood into the ink. They said it connected the artist and the artwork forever, binding their souls through sacrifice. The idea was as grotesque as it was sincere. In their fevered minds, pain purified creation, and suffering gave it depth. Blood replaced pigment. The artist's wound became part of the composition. As the engraving dried, its dark stains turned brown, merging into the lines of the etched figures. The smell of iron filled the room, and the artist smiled, convinced that he had captured something eternal. If we compare it to today, it would be like a painter believing his masterpiece must be signed in his own skin to prove its authenticity. The logic was madness, but madness had long been accepted as the twin of genius. The finished works were not displayed in galleries or shown to friends. They were hidden in drawers, wrapped in cloth, sealed between pages of books that promised salvation. Some were bound inside Bibles, their covers disguising the sin within. The hypocrisy was almost elegant. The same men who bowed before altars by day returned at night to worship their own desires, carving the forbidden and then concealing it inside holiness. I find it unsettling that a society so obsessed with purity built its most enduring art upon the secrecy of its corruption. Collectors whispered about these engravings, trading them like relics of blasphemy. To own one was to hold a piece of forbidden history. They were said to be alive, carrying the presence of the artist's blood, as though a fragment of his soul remained within each mark. A few even believed the works were cursed, that anyone who possessed them would suffer fevered dreams or hallucinations of the figures coming to life. These stories only increased their allure. In a world where morality dictated silence, sin became currency. The artists themselves often spoke of their work as a rebellion against hypocrisy. They claimed that through erotic art, they revealed truth, stripped of pretense. Yet their truth was narrow and self-serving. It glorified domination, submission, and secrecy, not honesty. Their engravings depicted bodies without faces, stripped of identity and emotion. Each figure was both victim and object, frozen in perpetual desire. The art said nothing of love, only of power disguised as intimacy. The more brutal the image, the more the artist felt he had transcended convention. He mistook obsession for insight, blood for brilliance, and shame for depth. In their hidden studios, the act of engraving became performance. The sound of metal scraping against wood mixed with the artist's laboured breath. Sometimes he would injure himself deliberately, slicing his palm to draw the ink of life. Drops of blood fell onto the carving, blending with the lines of his creation. To him, this was consecration. He whispered about unity between body and art, about transcending mortality. What he truly achieved was desecration, of himself, of his subject, and of the craft he claimed to honour. The most disturbing pieces were those carved into human skin. A few artists were said to have used preserved hides taken from medical cadavers, turning flesh into parchment. These works were small, detailed, and horrifyingly delicate. They glowed faintly under candlelight, the texture of pores still visible beneath the images of intertwined figures. The very idea that something once alive could be turned into a vessel for desire revealed how far art had fallen from grace. No one dared to display such pieces, but rumours of them spread through secret circles, keeping their legend alive. Over time, these engravings became symbols of rebellion, admired by those who misunderstood them as acts of courage. Young artists whispered that to suffer for art was to achieve immortality, and they too began to experiment with self-inflicted wounds, as though pain itself were a path to beauty. The line between art and obsession grew so thin that it vanished entirely. Blood became signature, secrecy became style, and the destruction of innocence became a mark of genius. The world outside remained blind. Museums continued to celebrate purity, morality, and progress, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, that beneath their foundations lay a hidden archive of blasphemy. These engravings never sought the light of exhibition because they were never meant to. They existed to satisfy hunger, not to express vision. They were not works of creation but of possession. Art turned inward until it devoured itself. Blood-soaked engravings of the Victorian underground revealed how far the pursuit of beauty could descend into worship of decay. These artists believed they were forging immortality through sin, yet all they created was evidence of their own corruption. Beyond those hidden drawers and false holy covers, a colder art was waiting, one that would turn to stillness itself and find inspiration in the flesh of the dead. Within the twilight of Victorian art, when beauty had already been corrupted by obsession, some painters turned to the only subject that could not resist the dead. To them, living models were too restless, too flawed, too human. They believed that only death could offer true stillness, the kind of silence that no breathing body could maintain. So they went to the morgues, the hospitals, the unclaimed chambers of the poor, and requested female corpses in the name of art. The officials, eager for payment or simply indifferent, obliged. What followed was a practice so morbid that it blurred the line between study and sacrilege. The painter stood before the body, brush trembling not from reverence but from fascination, seeing in death what life had refused to offer obedience. The studios that once held laughter and movement now become cold sanctuaries. The air smelled of oil paint and formaldehyde. The corpses were laid on tables draped with linen, their limbs arranged carefully to mimic life. Candles flickered across pale skin, creating the illusion of warmth where none remained. Painters called this preservation of form. They spoke of serenity, of divine calm, of beauty untouched by motion or decay. In truth, they were enamored with control. The body no longer protested, shivered beneath their gaze. The artist could paint without limit, without fear of rejection, without the interruption of breath. It is horrifyingly ironic that they found perfection only in the absence of life. These painters claimed their work elevated art to new heights. They said they were studying the line between life and death, capturing the eternal beauty of the body freed from spirit. They wrote in journals about the purity of stillness, calling it enlightenment. The truth was simpler. They mistook lifelessness for purity because it offered them mastery. Death gave them what consent never could. If we compare this to today, it would be like a photographer seeking authenticity only in disaster, calling devastation the truest form of art. The boundary between creation and violation had dissolved completely, and what remained was devotion to control disguised as curiosity. Some went further, bringing strands of the dead into their work. Locks of hair were clipped and tied with ribbon, kept as sources of inspiration. Fragments of clothing were folded neatly and stored alongside paintbrushes. Some even mixed bone dust into pigment, convinced that the essence of beauty could be absorbed into the art itself. The paintings that resulted were haunting faces, too calm, eyes too empty, skin rendered with impossible delicacy. Viewers described them as ethereal, touched by the divine. None realized that the glow they admired came from decay. I find it unbearable to imagine those quiet studios where death was dressed as beauty and worshipped with every brushstroke. The critics, as always, spoke in lofty tones. They praised the subtle stillness, the grace of repose, the purity of colour. Not one mentioned the source. It was easier to romanticize the illusion than to confront the truth. The art world preferred silence to scandal. Even when rumours spread of bodies borrowed from morgues, no one investigated. These painters were celebrated for their dedication, their pursuit of truth, and their refusal to compromise. The same society that condemned indecency in life accepted desecration in death. It was, as they said, art above morality. The women who became subjects of these works had no names. They were often the forgotten poor, the sick, the abandoned. Their bodies, once ignored in life, were suddenly valuable in death. Artists spoke of them as gifts of fate, instruments through which beauty could be studied without distraction. The irony was cruel. A woman could be invisible